wanted to start out with asking you, what role do you think higher education plays in a democracy? How important is it?
You know, all the way from Thomas Jefferson forward, Americans have realized that education is a key to maintaining a democratic representative government. It's essential for our way of life and in the way we want to organize society. So it's a vital function regardless of how you think about it in terms of careers.
What changes can we make and should we make to ensure that the United States gets back its competitive edge in a global society?
You know, we've a lot of challenges as a country, and it's very clear we don't want to be second place as Americans. We want to be first place, and a lot of that relates to our productivity and competitiveness as a nation. Higher education is part of that. Part of it, I think, deals with making sure we have high standards that have to be complied with. Part of it involves a reorganization of our federal government so that we are facing the discipline of setting priorities on spending, not simply funding everything else. Part of it involves rewarding hard work. Americans tend to work harder than almost any people on the face of the earth. It's one of our cultural traits that I think has helped make this country so prosperous. That needs to be reinforced by making sure people who work hard are rewarded along with that. I think state government has a role in all of that. We've got a real challenge in higher education because there's such a shortage of funding. And part of that means that we've got to be more efficient. We've got to control overhead. And I think we've got to recognize the distortions put on higher education because of the federal aid. And by that I mean federal aid's laid out so that the more an institution costs, the more aid's available, and the less an institution costs, the less aid's available. And so you've got built in from the federal government an incentive to make things more expensive and less productive. And that state legislators need to address. Obviously, hopefully, we'll get the federal government to change those incentives as well. But it's a challenge specifically for state legislators because they face such budget squeezes.
Yeah. Unfortunately, higher ed is something it's like the first thing to be cut in state budgets. I mean, is that the right approach? I mean, do states have a responsibility to provide an affordable education to everyone? And if so, how do they do that in tight budget times?
To me, as a state legislator or as a federal legislator, I always thought that higher education was one of the best investments that states made. My priorities, I found over the years, are not necessarily shared by everyone with it. Legislators are caught in a vice. They have mandatory spending increases imposed on them by the federal government. And by that I mean they have programs where the only way you get state money back from the federal government is if you match it. Now that's in the case with Medicaid, it'll be in the case with new health care programs. It's the case with regard to prisons where the federal courts mandate a level of cost with regard to it. So legislators are stuck with mandates that they don't control, along with limitations in their constitutions towards balancing the budget. So they face a tough job, and higher education's been the loser, not because it isn't worthy, but because legislators have had that imposed on them. I think we have to change that. It is a mistake for us to have one level of government make decisions and the other level of government pay for them. You don't make a good decision if you don't balance the benefit and the cost. The way we've increasingly made decisions with regard to states is to have the federal government make the decision and the states pay the bill, and it's not working.
Well, how do we change that?
I think partly you change it with regard to making sure the people we send to Congress don't do any more unfunded mandates and try and fund the mandates that they have put out. I think everyone is empathetic with the need, for example, to care for the handicapped and make sure they have adequate access. But that decision was made on the federal level without regard to thinking about the cost. What do we need to do? We need the federal government to look at what they mandate and to pay for what they mandate. So they have to temper their enthusiasm for helping people with the resources they're willing to put behind it.
Should it be a goal that everyone receives a college education? And if so, how do we rein in the constantly increasing tuition that students are having to pay?
You know, Americans are committed, unlike Europeans, to everyone having an opportunity. Doesn't mean they all go. Doesn't mean that everyone has to have a college education. But we do feel as Americans that everybody ought to have an opportunity, a chance. And all of our systems set up on that basis. You have different levels of institutions, from community colleges up to research universities, so there's different entry points. You also have funding assistance from the state and federal governments as well. So that's, I think, a commitment that most Americans are comfortable with. That is, the opportunities there. It doesn't mean everybody goes, but it does mean everybody has a chance to go with regard to it. I'd like to see that continue. But what we do need to do, I think, is make sure our institutions are as efficient and cost-effective as possible. And that gets down to the challenge with regard to tuition. As long as you have the misincentive of the federal government to reward higher cost and penalize lower cost, you're going to have that tendency to raise tuition.
Could you explain that a little bit, the higher costs versus the lower costs? So.
You know, the way federal assistance is made available, Pell Grants, with regard to loans, sometimes with regard to other scholarships, it's based on financial need and a federal calculation of financial need. In that financial need calculation that the federal government gives us, the higher tuition that a university charges, the more money and financial aid the student gets. The less the tuition is that the institution charges, the less money the student gets. We need to have that addressed because it is a driving force for institutions to raise tuition. We raise tuition and think we're solving the problem by increasing financial aid, but the reality is the middle income student that doesn't qualify for the financial aid but has to pay the higher tuition is the one caught in the middle and really squeezed out of the system.
So what is the answer to that? How do we get beyond that?
There are two basic reforms that need to be made, one on the federal level and one on the state level. On the federal level, we need to take a look at financial aid and make sure we're not providing an incentive for higher tuition. How do you do that? Well, one way would be to relate financial assistance to the majors that students have so that we make sure that if you're borrowing money to get your degree, that the degree you will get will be able to fund the income you'll get from that degree, will be able to fund the borrowings that you come up with. Secondly, we need to take a look at not providing the federal aid for high-cost institutions. And by high cost, I mean cost beyond what the discipline would require. If you're Harvard University and have $50,000 a year tuition and have $30 billion in assets that are meant to subsidize the university, maybe financial aid to Harvard, where they can afford to pay for it themselves, isn't as important as financial aid to an institution that simply doesn't have those resources. So matching the financial aid to institutions that need it, matching the financial aid depending on your majors so that you can afford to pay it back, I think all are important. And then I think putting some reasonable limits on how much you increase tuition for your institution to be qualified for the financial subsidies. On the state level, likewise, I think it's critical you have state legislators step forward and insist that institutions be run without excessive overhead, and insist that institutions be run with reasonable efficiency in terms of the faculty and the staff. There are simple measurements where you can evaluate institutions and have states set those standards. With state assistance, you can improve the cost structure for institutions, and with federal assistance, we can eliminate that incentive to overcharge.
Great. So how can state lawmakers balance exerting appropriate legislative authority while not micromanaging institutions?
Oh, it's a great question. Obviously, it's counterproductive for us to have state legislators manage the minute details. But what they can do is set general guidelines. For example, what portion of your budget do you spend on instruction, and what portion is non-instruction, that is overhead? Obviously, when we do that analysis, you're not looking at auxiliaries, that is residence halls and so on. You're not looking at research that's separately funded, but you're looking at the institution itself. Having a reasonable guidance on what portion of your budget goes to instruction is enormously helpful in controlling wasteful overhead. Likewise, I think having some standards with regard to the teaching load of faculty can be enormously helpful. The simple fact is, by a general guideline on teaching loads for faculty, you could dramatically improve productivity without micromanaging. You know, I know a lot of states have looked at this question, and a lot of commissions on higher education have spent a lot of time with regard to it. It was an important question when you had the state financing most of the cost of an education program. That is, if you could have a more efficient engineering program by having one in the state instead of having 5. But when you eliminated state aid or reduced it dramatically, then the institution's proclivity to have an engineering program, an expensive program, their incentive has dropped. They end up paying the cost for the higher program, not the state. And so that's one of the areas I think that the need for state guidance has kind of gone away as the amount of state assistance has gone away. If you want to have an expensive program in terms of preparing students, institutions will make that decision based on what resources they have and what demand they have for that program. On the other hand, if you have the state bearing most of the cost, obviously everyone's going to want it. So my guess is you're going to see states back away from trying to micromanage in that area because there simply isn't the need for it anymore.
Okay. Interesting. So what is your perspective on the federal government's recent push for more transparency, accountability, and cost control?
I'm a fan of the new moves for more transparency and cost control. I think it can be a very positive thing. It'll be a help to everyone who takes a look at that institution, but most importantly, it'll be a help to the institution. The simple fact is that with those outside guidance and with that transparency, it gives administrators at universities and colleges the tools they need to affect real change. Without that outside pressure, the inside pressures make it very difficult.
Interesting. So what accountability measures do you think state lawmakers should focus most on? It seems they're focusing on graduation rates. And
I hope state legislators do not use graduation rates as a measurement. And the reason I hope that is because it's an invitation to lower quality. The simple fact is you can give anybody a diploma. The Wizard of Oz had a 100% graduation rate. All you do is sign up a diploma and hand it out. But what it does is destroy quality at the institution. What they need to focus on, I think, is productivity of the faculty, efficiency of the administration, and what the students learn. We measure what students learn in many areas already: nursing, law, physicians, engineers, architects, a wide range of things. We ought to be measuring what students learn in other disciplines. There are already tests out there that do it. It's simply a matter of incorporating it as part of our measurement functions. One thing that will happen when we measure what students learn at colleges and universities is you will have a tool to make the institution more efficient, more productive, and a better quality education. As long as we hide our head in the sand and refuse to measure outcomes in that way, we're not going to have the kind of progress we need.
So looking into your crystal ball, where do you see higher education going in the next 20 years, and where do you want it to go?
Well, in the next 20 years, it's clear we face further cuts on the state level. And down the road, I think within the next decade, you're going to see major cuts in federal assistance simply because you don't have the money on the federal level to continue to do what we've done. My hope is that we'll take this as an opportunity, painful as it is, to dramatically improve our productivity and our efficiency and our relevancy as we go forward. Higher education is still a vital part of a representative democracy. We simply aren't going to be the country we want to have without it. And our economy is not going to be a world leader without it. So we face great challenges. But I think the American people, and particularly the wonderful talent that exists in higher education, can do it.
Well, you have a broad and unique perspective on national issues, being a former state legislator, congressman, U.S. senator, and president of two institutions, two universities. So how do you think things are going?
You know, we as a country are going through a cycle that every country that's become great and prosperous has faced, and that is reaching maturity, reaching prosperity. We face the dangers of prosperity. The simple fact is that when people become affluent, they lose motivation. We have been slowed because America's become prosperous. It's a dichotomy, perhaps. The real question is whether or not we can pull our bootstraps up and come back into the theater and compete as we once did. I think we can. I think Americans can recapture our vigor and our energy and our commitment. That's the challenge for the next decade.